Morning, everyone. It's great to see everybody. Good to have our visitors with us today. Bailey. We have to talk to him about Revelation 21:8. Have you ever made a promise to someone and failed to keep that promise? Or has somebody ever made a promise to you and failed to keep it? I think if we were all completely honest with ourselves, we could vote the affirmative in both cases. Now, a promise by definition is a declaration that one will do or refrain from doing something specified. It is a declaration that gives the person to whom it is made a right to expect. Now, the word promise appears in the Bible no less than 100 times, and the Bible gives all kinds of examples of promises. We have promises that we make to ourselves. We have promises that we make from one man to another man. We have the promises that God has made to us and promises that we have made to God. But you know, man doesn't always keep his promises, does he? And it's not going to take a whole lot of arguing, I think, to convince you that man does not always do what he says. Now, some people, of course, they don't keep their promises on purpose. They intentionally fail to do what they said they were going to do. How many of you all remember old Boss Hogg on the Dukes of Hazzard? You know, whenever he would make a promise and he would give you his word, you could pretty much be sure he wasn't going to keep that word because it seemed like he always had his fingers crossed behind his back. Now, if he went and promised you something and shook on it, you might be able to believe it. But if he spit in his hand and offered you his hand and shook on it, you could take that to the bank. But you know, nowadays, not even a signature will guarantee a person's truthfulness. But some people, of course, they don't keep their promises because they intended to when they made the promise, but because of extenuating circumstances or unforeseen situations, they just simply were not able to. But you know, when we consider God's promises, they are truly precious. Peter said in 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, according as his divine power hath given unto us all things that pertain to life and godliness, through the knowledge of him that hath called us to glory and virtue, whereby are given unto us exceeding great and precious promises, that by these we might be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. And the most precious promise that was ever given to us is the hope of eternal life in heaven with God. Now, God's promises are not only precious, but they are certain. Because of God's omniscience, because of his omnipotence, then his promises are unfailing. Listen to what King Solomon said of God's promises in 1 Kings 8, verse 56. He said, blessed be the Lord that hath given rest unto his people Israel. According to all that he promised, there hath not failed one word of all his good promise which he promised by the hand of Moses, his servant. Yes, God's promises will occur. I want you to listen to what the inspired apostle said about Abraham, the man of faith, in Romans chapter 4, verses 19 through 22. And being not weak in faith, he considered not his own body now dead, when he was about 100 years old, neither yet the deadness of Sarah's womb. He staggered not at the promise of God through unbelief, but was strong in faith, giving glory to God. And being fully persuaded that what he had promised he was able also to perform. And therefore it was imputed unto him for righteousness. God's promises are true. And they are sure, just like Peter said, the Lord is not slack concerning his promise. And he is faithful to his promises, for he is faithful who has promised, Hebrews 10:23. Now, of course, God has made two basic types of promises. You have unconditional promises, and you have conditional promises. The unconditional promises are made no matter what you do, no matter who you are, it doesn't matter how you live, these promises are for us and for our children forever. One of those promises that are unconditional that God made is that he will never, ever destroy this world by water again. That promise was made way back in Genesis chapter 9. This was not a promise just to Noah, but it was a promise made to all of mankind. And we have that promise, a token of that promise set in the clouds, the rainbow. Every time you see a rainbow, you can guarantee that God is still keeping his promise. The world will one day be destroyed, but it's not going to be by water. Another unconditional promise is that the Lord will return one day, 2 Thessalonians 1, verses 7 through 10. And no man is going to be able to prevent that, not even Satan himself. A third unconditional promise is that there's going to be a resurrection, John chapter 5, verses 28 and 29. Everybody will one day be resurrected from the dead. Those who have done good unto the resurrection of life. Those who have done evil unto the resurrection of damnation. So these promises, these unconditional promises, are for all people, for all time. The conditional promises are those promises that will occur depending upon our behavior and our response to the commandments of God himself. For example, the crown of life is going to only be given to those who are faithful unto death, Revelation chapter 2, verse 10. The forgiveness of sins is only for those who walk in the light as he is in the light, 1 John 1, verse 7. The rest for the weary is only for those who believe in Jesus Christ and learn of him. They come to him, Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30. And the guarantee for the necessities of life is only for those who seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, Matthew 6, verse 33. Do you really believe in those promises that God has given to us? If you do, there's conditions to be met. And are we keeping those conditions? Let's take our Bibles and let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 6. 2 Corinthians chapter 6. I want you to listen to what Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. We're going to begin in verse 14. And here Paul not only tells us of some of God's promises, but he also tells us how we can attain these promises. Listen to what he said, 2 Corinthians chapter 6, beginning in verse 14. He says, "Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what communion hath light with darkness? And what concord hath Christ with Belial? Or what part hath he that believeth with an infidel? And what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? For ye are the temple of the living God. As God has said, I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Wherefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you. And will be a father unto you. Ye shall be my sons and daughters, saith the Lord Almighty. Having therefore these promises, dearly beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God." What has God promised us? Well, notice these promises that we just read. Verse 16 of what we just read, I will dwell in them and walk in them. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Verse 17, I will receive you. Verse 18, I will be a father unto you, and ye shall be my sons and daughters. All of these denote a very special relationship with the Father. And one thing they denote is they denote a fellowship, having things in common with our Father who is in heaven, which also implies a partnership with him. But we also have the promise of family. And I'm talking about the family of God. These promises mean that we belong to each other. I belong to God. God belongs to me. There's going to be a mutual protection among us. God will fight for me, and I am going to fight for God. There's also a mutual love between us. All of this is vital, of course, in a wholesome physical relationship. But it's also vital for a spiritual relationship that we have with our Father who is in heaven. Now, these promises are of eternal value, and these are promises that we all need to be yearning for. But these promises fall within a conditional category. So we have to ask the question, how do we receive these promises? What do I have to do? Well, notice what Paul said. First of all, be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. In the day when oxen were yoked together to pull a plow or to do some other task, the two animals that were put in that yoke together had to be of comparable size, of comparable temperament, strength, and also of the same kind. An ox and a mule were not to pull together with the same plow and plow the same row. The Mosaic law forbade the joining of a mixed team in Deuteronomy 20:10 when it said, "Thou shalt not plow with an ox and an ass together." Now, using this familiar and very obvious truth as an illustration, Paul teaches these Corinthians of the need for them not being matched up with people who are not of like precious faith. If a believer is bound to an unbeliever, well, the believer is usually the one being influenced by the unbeliever and not vice versa. I don't know why that seems to be the case, but it's always the one who is the unbeliever that seems to have the greatest influence. Little do these two have in common, and oftentimes there will be disagreements. They will be at odds with one another, and each one would be pressed to go against their basic desires. I don't believe Paul was actually dealing with the marriage relationship when he talked about this, because he's talking with Corinthians and how they were being involved with the worldly affairs. And we're talking about a very worldly city here. We're talking about the city of Corinth. And they were full of idolatry, full of fornication. So he's dealing with them in this situation here. And he's not really talking about marriage, but he's talking about them wholly leaning on the life of a Christian. But it certainly could involve the relationship of marriage. So does this mean that if a believer is married to an unbeliever, or if they are joined in a business relationship with one another, does that mean that that believer is involved in sin? Well, the answer is only if the believer is influenced to go against their belief because of their mate or because of their partner, if they've been influenced to do evil by them. Now, I say this because Paul actually encouraged the believers to stay with the unbelievers in marriage in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 13. But in order to keep a relationship running smoothly, whether we're talking about marriage, whether we're talking about business, whether we're talking about a friendship, someone usually has to compromise. And again, it's usually the believer, the one doing the compromising. So driving home the point, Paul asked two rhetorical questions. What fellowship does righteousness and iniquity have? And what communion exists between light and darkness? God's precious promises will be beyond our grasp if we are yoked and pulling in unison with those of the world. It's inconsistent and almost impossible to be yoked together with the world and with God at the same time. In fact, Paul said in Ephesians 5, verse 11, "And have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them." He said in verse 7, "Be ye not therefore partakers with them." Or as James said in James chapter 4, verse 4, "Whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is the enemy of God." Since there is no common ground between the world and God, then Paul said in verse 17, that we are to come out from among them and be separate and touch not the unclean thing. So the command given to the saints is to separate themselves from these entangling alliances with those who are of the world, those that we formed with the infidels. Don't be pulling together. Don't be plowing the same row. And I'm not talking about divorce for the marriage situation here, but you cannot run to the same excess that they do. You're not going to be able to do the same things that they do. And it's going to be difficult. You may be joined together in one flesh, but you're not to be of the same spirit. So young people, if you decide to marry, make sure that you marry a Christian. And make sure they're a Christian before you ever marry them. Don't take their promise that they will become a Christian later on. I don't know how many times I've seen unions come together where the man or the woman promised, I will become a Christian once we get married. And guess what? It never happens, seems like. More times than not, they will end up being married to an unbeliever, and there's going to be problems. Not only problems with your relationship, but especially when you have children. Because there's going to be an influence upon your children that you're not going to really want. Christians are to be a special people. We are called out of darkness, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. And we are to touch no unclean thing. In the Mosaic dispensation, when a man touched something that was unclean, he was not allowed into the congregation of Israel until he purified himself. The uncleanness there was of the flesh. Now we're talking about the spirit. In chapter 7, verse 1 of our text, Paul says, let us cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit. Our flesh is defiled when our hands and our bodies and our feet do the bidding of sin. And our spirits are defiled when we gladly contemplate that sin. Paul warns us not only against the actual contact of the sin of the flesh, but also the consent of the spirit, which defiles the inner man. Now, the work of purification is commonly referred to as the work of God. But it's plainly taught that this is done only as those who are cleansed who cooperate with him in its accomplishment. So, yes, we do the work of God in our flesh, but we're doing it because that's what God wants us to do. We're accomplishing his will. Paul said in Philippians 2, verses 12 and 13, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God which worketh in you to will and to do of his good pleasure. And if God's love that is manifested through Christ does not arouse us, if it does not direct us, if it does not create in us a desire for holiness and the perseverance to accomplish that, it's because we refuse to hear and to obey his will. And finally, if we are to receive the promises of God, we must, of course, perfect holiness in the fear of God. We must go forward in faithful obedience and perfect ourselves in a holy life. We are to strive for that perfection. This doesn't mean that we have to just practice obedience, but we also have to complete that obedience and bring it to perfection. We have to live and strive for the holy life. To do these things, we have to reverence God with fear. All contact with impurity is a defilement, and it's an insult to the spirit that dwells in us. And therefore, fear as well as respect and hope should cause us to abstain from all sin. Now let's look at some key passages as we close our lesson this morning on how the Bible talks about being separate from the world. In Titus chapter 2, verse 12, Titus is told by Paul that the grace of God that teaches us that we are to deny ungodliness and worldly lust, and we are to live soberly and righteously and godly in this present world. There are two things we have to do. We have to deny, reject, and we have to refuse ungodliness. And we have to live soberly and righteously with self-discipline and with self-control. Then Paul said that controlling the mind is also essential. In 2 Corinthians 10, verse 5, he said, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringeth into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. This separation that the Bible talks about first has to begin in the mind. We have to be willing to do so, and if we're not willing to do so in our mind, then it's not going to happen in the flesh. John tells us in 1 John 2, verse 15 through 17, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world passeth away, and the lust thereof. But he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. In Romans chapter 12, verse 1 and 2, we have these words by the Apostle Paul. present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Peter said it this way in 1 Peter 1, verses 14 and 16, as obedient children, not fashioning yourselves according to the former lust in your ignorance, but as he which hath called you is holy, so be ye holy in all manner of conversation. For it is written, be ye holy, for I am holy. Jesus himself said in Matthew 6:24, no man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. And then James, the brother of our Lord, said in James chapter 4, verse 4, ye adulteresses and adulteresses, know ye not that friendship of the world is enmity with God? Whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is the enemy of God. Time and again, the Bible stresses there has to be a separation between us and the world. We cannot allow ourselves to be taken up by the world. So there's no doubt God demands a separation. And you know, the way that we live will have a tremendous impact upon our relationship with our God. Now, to receive these promises, we first have to become Christians. We have to be freed from all past guilt of sin. We do this through obedience of the gospel. And of course, as the scriptures teach, we do have to believe that Jesus is who he claimed to be, the very Son of God, John 8:24. We have to be willing to repent of our sins, Acts 17, verse 30, Luke 13, verse 3. That means we need to change from what we were doing, the ways of the world, and now we walk the ways of God. We have to confess Jesus Christ before men with our mouths, Romans 10, verse 9 and 10, Matthew 10, verse 32. And then finally, we have to be baptized into Christ. That puts us in Christ, where all spiritual blessings are found, Ephesians 1, verse 3, including salvation and prayer, the forgiveness of sins. We cannot have these things without being in Christ. Of course, that's just the beginning. That's when we are born again. That's when we become babes in Christ. And then we have to walk in the light of the gospel. And we have to grow in knowledge, 2 Peter 3, verse 18, to go on unto perfection. So if we will just meet the conditions that Paul gave us here in our text this morning, then God will be a father to us, and he will treat us like sons and daughters. And then we can be eligible to receive the inheritance that God has offered to us, the inheritance, the hope of eternal life. But it is conditional upon your response to his word. And maybe if you have not ever responded to his word in a proper way, you have that opportunity this morning. If you're not a child of God, we encourage you to become one. Be born again of water and the Spirit, John chapter 3, verse 5. And if you're a child of God, you've allowed yourself to creep back into the world. Let's make sure people recognize that separation once again. If there's anything that you need to repent of, maybe you need the prayers of the congregation to give you strength, to help you along, we are here for you. If there's anything that we can help you with, let your request be made known while together we stand and sing.